Have you ever had that moment, where you run into two totally different takes on the same event? Maybe something from history you thought you knew, and then boom, a completely contradictory account pops up. It could feel a bit like the rug's been pulled out from under you. When facts seem to clash like that, how do you even start to figure things out without just feeling lost? Well, that's exactly what we're going to dig into today. This deep dive is all about something called contested knowledge. Our mission, really, is to give you the tools, the mental toolkit, if you like, to not just see these different perspectives, but to understand why they're different, how to evaluate them critically, and, how to build a more complete, more nuanced picture for yourself.
That's right. We're aiming to go beyond just saying, oh, there are different sides. We want to explore the deeper reasons why information gets shaped and shared the way it does, sometimes even why it gets hidden. By the end of our chat today, you, the listener, should have a much clearer sense of how to navigate these conflicting stories and, frankly, become a more discerning thinker.
Okay, so let's unpack this term, contested knowledge. Are we just talking about, simple disagreements, or is there something more fundamental going on?
That's a great question. It's definitely more than just disagreement. Contested knowledge really refers to those ideas or interpretations that are actively debated, challenged, because people are looking at them through fundamentally different lenses. These lenses, they're shaped by different perspectives, different values, different life experiences, and often different positions of power. It means that what we often think of as solid facts, especially about the past, are actually interpretations. History isn't just one single story. It's often a collection of conflicting viewpoints. And here's the really interesting part. Sometimes multiple, even contradictory views can both have validity. It just depends on the evidence you're looking at and the context.
Wow, okay. So it's less about hunting for the one true version and more about understanding the whole landscape of potentially valid interpretations depending on where someone's standing. That really shifts how you think about learning about anything, really. Why is grasping this idea so important for us, especially now?
It's absolutely crucial because it pulls back the curtain on how history and information in general gets made. It shows us it isn't some neutral record keeper. It's a narrative. And it's profoundly shaped by who had the power, the platform, the means to tell the story. People don't just record events. They record them through their own filters, their background, beliefs, social standing, you name it. If you don't get this concept of contested knowledge, you might just accept the first or loudest version you hear as the whole truth, missing out on the richer, messier, often more accurate reality that emerges when you start looking at those conflicting accounts together.
Right. And that makes it so vital to actively look for those other viewpoints, doesn't it? Especially the ones that maybe got pushed aside or even deliberately silenced over the years. Without doing that digging, you're basically working with an incomplete puzzle. It's a really key part of, your journey to genuinely understanding something fully. So, okay, we're faced with these different versions, these contested ideas. How do we actually start to make sense of them, without just getting overwhelmed? Are there practical tools?
Oh, absolutely. The bedrock tools here are primary and secondary sources. Now, we probably all heard these terms in school, but when dealing with contested knowledge, understanding the nuance is everything. Primary sources are your raw materials. They come directly from the time period you're looking at. Think personal diaries, original speeches, photos taken right then, maybe a newspaper article published the next day. They give you that direct window. But, and this is a big but, while they're direct, they're still filtered through that specific person's immediate viewpoint, their biases, what they chose to see or record.
Okay, so direct, but not necessarily objective. Got it. What about secondary sources then?
Secondary sources are interpretations of those primary materials. They're usually created later, often by historians, scholars, journalists, documentary makers. So things like textbooks, academic articles, historical documentaries, those are secondary. They analyze, they synthesize information, they provide context. The real skill, the interesting part, is comparing these. How does a secondary source interpret the primary evidence? What biases might that author have? How does it stack up against other secondary accounts?
Oh, so it's not just about reading the source, but figuring out the perspective behind it, even for a primary source like a diary. That's where it gets really interesting, like you said. The key seems to be comparing who is speaking, when they spoke or wrote, and what angle they're pushing or what they're emphasizing. By layering those things, you can start building a much more critical, much more complete picture, not just of the past, but of contested issues right now. Okay, let's make this really concrete. How about we look at a major historical example, the British colonization of Australia, unquote. From the perspective of the British Empire arriving in 1788, the legal justification rested on the concept of terra nullius, basically, land belonging to no one. This view framed Australia as empty, legally available for taking. But then you have the indigenous Aboriginal perspective. This land wasn't empty at all. It was, and is, home to hundreds of distinct nations, each with incredibly deep, ancient connections, spiritual, cultural, legal, stretching back tens of thousands of years.
Right. And when you look at the sources here, the power imbalance just leaps out at you. For the British view, you've got primary sources like official government documents, royal decrees, colonial maps, ship logs, all using language that supports terra nullius. For the Aboriginal perspective, the primary sources are very different. They include things like ancient oral histories passed down generation after generation, intricate songlines mapping the land, traditional laws, rock art. These existed long before 1788. Now, secondary sources today, like modern historical analyses or reconciliation reports, try to bridge this gap. But you absolutely have to acknowledge the historical reality. The British Empire had the military might, the legal system they imposed, the political dominance. This power was used to systematically invalidate Aboriginal knowledge, to exclude their voices from the official records for centuries. It's only relatively recently, in the last few decades really, that these perspectives have started to gain broader recognition. The dominant narrative was very deliberately constructed and enforced.
That's a powerful illustration of how power shapes the knowledge that gets passed down. Okay, let's shift gears. How about a 20th century example that still generates a lot of heat? The use of the atomic bomb in 1945. The official U.S. government narrative, certainly for a long time, was that dropping the bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki was a necessary evil, that it ended World War II quickly and ultimately saved lives, particularly American lives, that would have been lost in a land invasion of Japan. But then you have a starkly different perspective from critics, and perhaps most poignantly, from the survivors themselves. They argue it was militarily unnecessary, potentially racially motivated, and caused unimaginable, horrific suffering and long-term consequences.
And the sources reflect this deep division. Primary sources for the U.S. side include things like President Truman's public announcements, military planning documents, scientific reports from the Manhattan Project. On the other side, you have the incredibly moving, often harrowing first-hand testimonies of the Hibakusha, the survivors of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Their accounts paint a picture of human cost that official reports often glossed over. Secondary sources. Well, historians are still fiercely debating this. Was it militarily essential? What were the alternatives? What were the long-term geopolitical motives? Was it a war crime? The debate rages on. And again, look at the power dynamic. For decades after the war, the U.S. narrative emphasizing strategic necessity, saving lives largely dominated Western understanding. The experiences and the voices of the Japanese civilians who endured the bombings were often marginalized, underreported, certainly in mainstream Western accounts. This shaped public perception for a very long time.
It really highlights how the victor often gets to write the first draft of history, doesn't it? Okay, let's bring it right up to the present day. Something you probably see argued about online constantly. Public figures and cancel culture. On one hand, you have the argument that cancel culture, or whatever term you want to use, is actually a form of public accountability. It's about holding people, especially those with influence, responsible for harmful speech or actions. It's seen as a way to demand better standards.
Right, that's one perspective. But then you have the counter-argument, that it's gone too far, that it stifles free speech, creates a climate of fear where people are afraid to engage in honest debate, make mistakes, or even evolve in their thinking.
So the sources here look a bit different, right? We're talking social media posts, maybe public apologies that get dissected, interviews, online articles.
Exactly. Primary sources are things like the original tweet or statement, the video clip, the apology text, interviews with the person involved or those calling them out. Secondary sources would be opinion pieces, cultural commentary analyzing the trend, maybe sociological studies trying to understand the dynamics of online shaming and accountability movements. Now, the power dynamics here are really complex and, frankly, constantly shifting. Sometimes a very influential person with a huge media platform can weather the storm or even use the controversy to gain more attention. Other times, particularly for individuals from marginalized communities, the consequences of being canceled can be much more severe, with fewer resources or platforms to respond. Social media movements can mobilize quickly and have real impact, but who wields that power and who feels the brunt of it can be very uneven. And I think it's really important to stress here, our goal isn't to decide if cancel culture is good or bad. It's to understand the different arguments, the different experiences, and crucially, the power dynamics that influence who gets heard, who gets condemned, and why.
That makes sense. It's about understanding the phenomenon itself. So, taking all these examples, all this complexity, what does it mean for you, the listener, when you run into these kinds of disagreements day to day? I mean, it feels like you eventually have to land somewhere, right? Make some kind of judgment. How do you do that responsibly?
That really is the million-dollar question, isn't it? And yes, I think it's okay, often even necessary, to form a judgment or considered opinion. But a responsible judgment, when faced with contested knowledge, needs a few key ingredients. First, you have to genuinely recognize the different perspectives exist. Don't just immediately shut down views that challenge your own or make you uncomfortable. Try to understand why someone might hold that view. Second, and this is critical, always acknowledge who holds power in the situation. Think historically empires, governments, institutions that shaped the records. And think currently media outlets, corporations, influential social groups, political parties. How might their power be shaping the narratives you're hearing? And third, always, always consider the sources of knowledge. Who gets to tell the story? Whose voices are amplified? And maybe most importantly, who is missing? Whose perspective isn't represented in the information you have access to? That silence can speak volumes.
That's a really practical framework. Recognize perspectives, acknowledge power, consider the sources, especially who's missing. Following that kind of approach, it feels like it moves you beyond just picking a side based on gut feeling. It helps build not just more knowledge, but real empathy, sharper critical thinking, and a much deeper, more honest understanding of history and the world around us.
Absolutely. And maybe a final thought for me is this. Contested knowledge isn't really a problem that needs a final solution, like finding the one hidden truth. It's more like a, a fundamental characteristic of how we humans understand and debate our world. It's a dynamic landscape that we need to learn to navigate, to explore with curiosity, rather than seeing it as just a battleground to win.
Yeah, that's a great way to put it, a reality to explore. And the tools we've talked about today, really engaging with those multiple viewpoints, digging into both primary and secondary sources with that critical lens, always keeping an eye on those power dynamics. These are the things that empower you. They make you a better thinker, a more savvy consumer of information, and a more informed participant in the world. So we hope this deep dive gives you a starting point. Use these ideas as you come across information every day. Let this be the beginning of your own informed exploration into the fascinating world of contested knowledge.